All right, everyone, how's it going? I'm going to talk to you about the idea of APIs and how you can leverage them for SEO and other forms of marketing. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Paul Shapiro. I'm the head of SEO at Catalyst. We're an agency owned by Group M, and we focus on search, SEO, PPC, social media, marketing, paid social, right out of Boston. It snowed earlier today, so it's chilly up here. Again, this is for a good cause. I just want to encourage people to consider donating. St. Jude's is a great organization, and it's $100, $50, $10, whatever you can give. It's definitely appreciated. All right. I don't know how many people in the audience are familiar with this image. This is, the Mars rover. This is from the Mars Pathfinder mission back in the 90s. It was sort of like a big deal in my household. My family was super into this Mars mission, almost to a fault. We had pictures of Mars hanging on our walls. It was sort of a big deal. The Mars rover was sending back images, and you were really seeing Mars in a way that you weren't seeing it before. And my father was super into this. He hung pictures up. There was more pictures up of Mars than there was of I think our family. And as a result, my parents, my dad used to teach me about the mission. I was a young kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and he used to tell me about all different aspects of the mission. The Mars rover, the Sojourner rover, had various instruments on it, different the research that they were setting forth to do on Mars. One of those instruments, I used to go to class and say it over and over again, and that was alpha proton X-ray spectrometer. I thought I was so cool saying this big word that I barely knew the meaning of. I was hearing it at home, and I thought it was cool for using a big word. So when you hear the word APIs, I want you to avoid what I was actually doing. And what I was actually doing was I was initiating term vomit. I heard a big fancy word. It sounded cool in the context of my conversation, without really understanding the meaning. I want you to come away from this presentation and understand what an API is, how it can be applied to you, your business, your work, and not just being a 6-year-old kid initiating, undergoing term vomit. Cool. So brings us to the point. So what is an API? And in the context of this presentation, we're actually talking about RESTful web APIs. There are some other types of APIs, but the RESTful web APIs are the more applicable type of API, and usually what people are referring to when they talk about an API. So what is an API? First of all, an API is an acronym. It stands for Application Programming Interface. Cool. Sounds a bit like term vomit. So what this actually distills down to is this concept. So APIs provide you a way to interface with external web services. So what does that mean? This enables you to do things like automation, incorporate other third-party systems into your own application, your own services, and you can sort of mutually benefit. So you can expand your system, and then you send data back to their system and sort of enhance the usage of that tool, that web interface on their end. So how does this work exactly? Let's take a step back, sort of have an understanding of how the web actually functions. These guys on the left represent typical web users on their computer. They're connected to the internet, and they're accessing a server. Every time you go to a website, you're accessing a server. A server is essentially another computer on the same network as all these people. This big network we call the internet, the World Wide Web. So they're connected to the server. So, and these are a series of requests going back over the HTTP protocol. So they go to a website that's sending a request from the server. It's getting returned a response. They're seeing the website. They post a form. They're sending data to that server, and the server gives some sort of response. Now, this is sort of facilitated via this concept called CRUD. So CRUD is another great acronym. Stands for create, read, update, delete. And this just, I think, makes a lot of intuitive sense. You're dealing with data essentially. So you're either creating data, you're reading data, you're updating existing data, or you're deleting existing data. And this is applicable in a world of where there's databases. This is applicable in the world of websites that have their own systems and with RESTful web services. Now, these CRUD operations are facilitated via what are called methods. So it's just a way of interacting essentially. Sometimes they're referred to as verbs, and these operations are being facilitated by these verbs. And this will make a little bit more sense when we go through a few examples. So get and post. Get and post are probably the most commonly used methods or verbs with web APIs. And just to conceptualize the get method, at least, every time you visit a website, you put a URL into your browser, you put google.com into your browser, you're using the get method or verb. So you're reading data, that's the CRUD operation, read, and it's being facilitated via the get method. So you put google.com into your browser, it reads the Google's response back to you. And that is actually an example of a web API. So we just covered get. It's used to request data from a specified resource, in that case, a website via server. Post is the other really common one, which is, unlike get, it's actually being used to send data to a server to either create or update a resource. These are two other ones that are a little less common than the others, but also really important. Put is used to send data to a server, create or update a resource, a little bit different than post, but I'm not going to get too much into the nuance there. Delete is used to actually delete a resource. So if you had a piece of data that you submitted via a form and you actually wanted to remove it from a website, you use the delete method. All right, so let's use an analogy to make a little bit more sense of this now. So this is a spice company, and they have a catalog order form. So in order to send an order to this company and receive your spices, you have to fill in a various bit of information. You have to put in your billing info, your shipping address. You have to specify which item numbers you want, what the name is, what the price is, how much quantity you have, what's the subtotal, etc. And you could do this, conceptualize this as if it were a web API. So if we wanted to turn this catalog order form into an API, this is essentially how you would do it. So first you need a look at what the company's inventory is, what is actually depicted in the catalog. So you would use the get method to return catalog items. So it'll give you a list of products, and then you can sort of apply automated business logic, or if you were doing a web interface where people could log in, they could sort of pick and choose using that method. And then they need to actually create a purchase. So that's going to be handled via a post method. So they're going to need to document, and this can be done automatically by the computer program. Which SKUs do they want? Is there an associated SKU ID? What quantity? What are the prices? And then you just send this information, this data payload, to the server using the post method, and then sometime after that, you'll have an order of spices to your door. And when you're using the post method, you're sending this sort of data payload. A common format for that is JSON. JSON is just a sort of a way of formatting data, structured data. And it might look something like this. So you have an account ID, that's some sort of ID unique to you, to your username. You have your shipping address with all the associated information, and then you have your order information. So you have an item number, SKU number, how much quantity you have. The computer system will, maybe it'll calculate the subtotal, and then it will you also submit payment information, and then you send that information out, and an order gets completed. All right. Now, enough for an analogy. Let's look at a more tangible, real-world example. So this is an example using the Google Auto Suggest API. Now, Google talked about sunsetting this a long time ago. It's still active, fortunately. And I actually think it's a very simple API to understand. So you take this URL, this suggestqueries.google.com, the rest of that URL, and then there's this URL parameter at the end, q equals. So that q equals can be anything. So the actual value there, I've put in a URL encoded word board games. So board %20 games. That %20 just represents a space character. And you can put anything in there, and then you'll get a response. And because it's a get method API, if you were to just put this into your web browser, you'd see the response just like a computer program designed to interface with this API would. And by the way, just to understand this term API endpoint, an API endpoint is just essentially like a URL that you would put into a browser in order to utilize an API. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but that is the basic concept. So you take this URL now, you put it into your web browser, it has the value board games inserted into there, and you get a response. The response comes back in the form of XML. Now, this one returns XML. Another common format is JSON. Sometimes you see CSV or unformatted text, but this one does come back with an XML response. So you have this suggestion tag and the data attribute with a value equal to each auto suggestion from Google. You have board games for kids, board games for adults, etc. And then you would utilize your computer system to actually parse that data and put it into whatever format you actually wanted. So you get a list, for example, of all these various outputs from the board game suggestion: board games for kids, board games for adults again, etc. Now, again, what use is this for you? So if you've used any of these services, Answer the Public, Ubersuggest, KeywordTool.io, these are all services that have made use of this API and like APIs. They've essentially, if you wanted to create one of these tools yourself, this is how you would do it. You'd write some code to, sort of iterate through different variations. So that bulleted list there at the bottom, it's going board games, and then it's appending like another word. So can, versus, how, and then you see the various responses come back associated with those different things. That's how Answer the Public works. That's how Ubersuggest works. And if you wanted to create this, that's how you would do it. Let's look at another example. So another fairly simple example, GrepWords. So GrepWords is a paid API that's used to get keyword data. So you can get search volume from it. I think you can get suggestions from it. And it's fairly easy to work with. This is also a get method-based API. It works very similarly to the one we just shared with the auto suggest. The difference is that this one requires, because it's a paid service, an API key. And even sometimes free services will use an API key because you'll have certain limitations, and that API key will help assert those limitations. API keys are essentially just like passwords. So you have a unique password or API key associated with your account, and then their systems can keep track of that and maybe allocate a certain number of credits, how many times you can actually access that API. So here, the endpoint is api.grepwords.com, and then you use your unique API key, and then you have the Q attribute, and that's another variable, and you'd iterate through various different keywords that you have in a list somewhere that your computer program is accessing some way. Maybe it's from a CSV or a hand-coded form, and it's just gonna loop through each one and get the different responses. So if we look for the response, so unlike the other one, this is a JSON response. So I input my own secret API key, and I put in the word board games, you get this JSON response. So you get things like the keyword comes back, and the date that the CPC was updated. Each month of data, their search volume, so month one search volume, the global monthly search volume, in which case for board games is 246,000. And then you'd again design a computer system to sort of just interpret that JSON, and you get some sort of like tabular data that maybe conceptually looks like this. You get a column that is keyword, has the name board games, and then the search volume 246,000. If that makes any sense. Okay, so we're talking about some concepts that are really you can understand using the examples. If you really wanted to go ahead and apply them a little bit more significantly, it probably does require some concept of computer programming or the use of a developer to create systems. Although there's definitely value in just purely understanding it. We don't have enough time for me to sort of get into the nitty gritty of how to do computer programming. I might touch on it a little bit, but I do run a conference, Tech SEO Boost, a conference dedicated solely to technical SEO and these sort of technical things that may help enhance your work and do better SEO. Last year I gave a presentation that was sort of like an introduction to computer programming. So if that's something you're interested in digging a little bit more into, these presentations are freely available. Go check them out. You can check out my introduction to computer programming for SEOs and marketers. That's the URL. All right, this is about as deep as we're going to get into the computer programming. So let's look at an actual a piece of Python script that can use the GrepWords API in order to pull search volume. I'll go through this line for line. It is 8 total lines. This is a short piece. Is a short computer program, a short piece of code, and I think it's fairly easy to sort of conceptualize, even if you don't understand the specific syntax. Line 1. So we're importing a library. This is just telling the Python code to use the request library, which helps facilitate using APIs and downloading things from websites. Line 2, this is import JSON. This is importing the JSON library. This is just giving the computer program the ability to parse JSON. Line 3, okay, we're creating a variable called board games that is a list of board games. So these are 3 board games I personally enjoy. Gaia Project, Great Western Trail, Spirit Island. It's just a list of board games, again. So 4 is actually a for loop. So this is a type of loop. So we talked about earlier, so if you had a list of different things and you wanted to use this API on every one of them, you would loop through each one. And that's what this is doing. It's a type of loop. It's going to go through each board game in that list of board games above until there are no more board games left in the list, and it's going to execute all the code underneath that. So line 5 is we're going to actually create the API URL. So you can see API URL equals that sort of base of the URL ends in the Q parameter, and then we're appending X, which is each board game in the list above. So it's going through the first board game, and then it's going to hit line 6. So we're creating this variable R, which is just downloading that API URL. Line 7 is actually parsing that JSON into a format that you can sort of dissect later. And line 8, in which it is extracting just the search volume part of the JSON. So you look at the actual output of this. You put this code into your command line, into your Python interpreter, and at the very bottom you see the output. So for each one of those games, Gaia Project, Great Western Trail, Spirit Island, it is outputted as search volume 1300, 2900, 5400. It just works. Right. Another example, very similar program. It looks pretty close to the previous one, using the Google Auto Suggest API. Again, we're using the request library to download data. Instead of JSON, it's XML, so we're using the element tree library. We have a list of board games. We're going through a for loop, which we're constructing using that endpoint, and then it's iterating and parsing the XML. And for that, we get a different output. So for every list of board games there, it gives you the first several suggestions. So for Gaia Project Rules, Gaia Project Review, Gaia Project versus Terra Mystica, which is another board game. And then it does the Great Western Trail iteration, does Great Western Trail expansion, Great Western Trail rules, and so on. It's looping through everything in that list. So I think you can sort of at this point start to conceptualize how APIs can be used. If you were to incorporate this data into your program or into your work, this could speed things along. You could do more advanced stuff with this if you incorporate your other data or your other whatever, your business logic, maybe other computer programs. You can do some interesting things. So. And that's actually where a lot of the magic comes, is when you start combining these things, these APIs together with other things. So let's look at an example of combining these two APIs. So this is, again, it's essentially just that. It's combining the two APIs. So first, it gets a list of suggestions from the Google Auto Suggestion API. And then each one of those suggestions that comes out of it is being put through the GrepWords API to get their search volume. So every suggestion that comes out is getting an associated search volume via the GrepWords API. And the output looks like this. So if you look at the after the section of code, the output, so it says board games, then it lists the associated search volume for board games, 246,000. The next suggestion is Board Game Geek, and that's 27,100 is the search volume. Board games for kids, 33,100, and so on. So you've just combined two APIs and made a more robust system out of them. Cool. All right. So the rest of the presentation is going to go pretty quick. Give you an example of how to use the Google Autocomplete API. Give you an example of how to use the GrepWords API. Now I just want to go through some other API examples. I'm not going to go through them line by line and how the code works. This presentation will be made available somewhere. And if you want to copy and paste this code, it's all functional code that you can use as examples. If you want to build upon it, use it for whatever you're doing. Just have a sense of some other APIs that exist for SEO and what you can do with them. Webpagetest.org. If anyone's doing web performance optimization, trying to make really fast websites, we all know that webpagetest.org is an amazing resource, and they have a pretty decent API. I think it allows for 200 calls for free. I'm not sure. I assume that's per day, but it may be per month. Anyway, I have to check. So here's some code for webpagetest.org. You have a list of test URLs: Search Wilderness, Try Think Tank, Search Engine Land, and it's going to go through there, and it's going to get some of the metrics. In this case, it's doing the lighthouse test, and it's getting for just the first view, because web page test does several views to sort of play with the caching and whatnot. It's getting the FCP, the first contentful paint, and extracting that for each one of those URLs. You could sort of schedule that on a regular basis and sort of document this data over time. And if you just want to conceptualize how you would use that. SEMrush. So SEMrush is really a wealth of data, and their API is pretty simple to use. So here's some SEMrush example. You need to put in a domain name. You put in your unique API key because it's a paid service again, and that's your super secret password for using the API. And then this program will go through for that domain name. It'll spit out the the various keywords, their associated position, search volume, and URLs for each of those keywords associated with that domain name. Cool. Google Analytics. If you're doing any sort of automated reporting, playing with your analytics data, this is extremely useful. And I don't even need to give you your own code, because Google makes this code available online. It's fairly easy to work with. These are the URLs with the example code, and then you could get for each domain name associated sessions, and all the various metrics that you're tracking in analytics, and sort of incorporate that into a larger program. Moz, using as an example for backlink data. So this is Moz actually makes a Python library that I'm utilizing here. So this will, this will, for a domain name, give some sort of backlink information. So it's, it'll give you domain authority, page authority, and some backlink info. Search Console. Again, this is actually some freely available on my personal blog. I use it to sort of download all the search, the query data from Search Console and back it up to a database on some level of frequency. You can combine this with cron jobs to sort of schedule that. JROX has an alternative version if you're working in with Google Cloud to sort of back it up to BigQuery. So again, pretty useful for data analysis. Webhose.io, really cool service. It's an API. If you've ever used anything like a BuzzSumo or like the content section of Ahrefs, this is essentially how you would roll your own service of that using the webhost data source, and it has some pretty unique service features. So here again, it's you have to have your own unique API key, and you put in a search, a query, and then it'll give you a list of what's being shared on social media for that query, the title, the associated interactions on Facebook, or whatever social media thing that you actually want to extract from that. It's pretty interesting, again. Reddit. So Reddit I use a lot for content creation ideas. This is, again, a tool that some code I made freely available on my blog. It's pretty neat. So you put in a username, password, and then some API information in the form of the client ID and the client secret. And then you can put in a whole boatload of search terms. So I like to do things like how to and can I or where do I, those sort of like question phrases. And then, maybe, the actual subject of your website, and sort of see what's being shared on Reddit, what has gotten the most upvotes, the most comments, and sort of use that to inform some content strategy. Wayback Machine. If you wanted to look at all the sort of historic data being cataloged in Wayback Machine, you can use the API to sort of do this automatically. It's a very few lines of code. You put in a domain name, and this will output a list of all the associated URLs cataloged by the Wayback Machine, and then you could go ahead and use there's actually a separate API for this to actually get the Wayback Machine formatted URLs that you could maybe then dump into another program and download. Voice is breaking up a little bit. And then without code examples, but just to make mention of some other services that have APIs that are very useful. Stat or whatever rank tracking tool you use, many of them have APIs. Google Natural Language Processing, their tool, their API for that can be used for, if you can imagine, many different things. If you don't want to train your own machine learning model, there's APIs that sort of are pre-trained and you can leverage. Any cloud crawlers you have, deepcrawl, Botify, you can sort of extract that data, funnel it into a report or an analysis. If you're accepting payment information, you're probably going to use something like Stripe, which is an API-based payment processor. If you want to use geolocation data, you can use Google Maps, Foursquare, other map associated APIs. If you want to, play with, your project management workflow, there's, Slack API, Whois data, sky's the limit. A lot of services have APIs nowadays. Again, I just listed a lot of individual APIs, and I want to sort of bring this together in an example that is tangible, combining various services together for a unique purpose. So we'll go through one more example. And this is available on GitHub via Git. This screenshot on the left, this is actually in the form of a Jupyter notebook. Jupyter notebook is sort of a people who use Python for data analysis, a format in which they often use they use their Python scripts in this format. So this is freely available, and this is if you want to find expired domain names linked to from like an industry forum or niche source. You can use this script to do that. So essentially, you use Screaming Frog or another crawler and get the outlink report. So you'll have a list of all the domain names that is being linked to from that source. You distill all those URLs. You change them from long URLs to domain names. So you extract the domain names from those URLs. Step 3, use that Moz Linkscape API to check the page authority and domain authority for each one of those URLs. So you can sort of only care about certain page authority, domain authority thresholds. Then step 4, you check whether that domain is active. You check the HTTP status. Is that returning a 404 to give you some indication if it's still a live domain name. And then lastly, you use a Whois API to see if it's available or unavailable. I think this particular Whois API was a little bit iffy. It wasn't always accurate, but you get the idea. And it could definitely, if you're trying to pick up some domain names with a little bit of backlinks on them already, this is definitely a viable way of thinking about it by leveraging 1, 2, 3 or so APIs into a system. And if you want to really sort of apply this further, me and several people, Hamlet Batista, Jared Oaks, Tom Anthony from Distilled, Brittany Muller, we're working on this project called the Machine Learning Toolkit for SEO. And this is essentially, this whole little toolkit that can be used for machine learning applications. So it gives you access to some APIs, ways of ingesting data, ways of cleaning that data, and sort of compiling those out together into sort of a way of applying machine learning and doing research on that data. So that's another way to be thinking about it. If you're interested in machine learning and APIs, definitely check that out. And you can see like GR set up a Jupyter notebook playing with some of these APIs already. So there's SEMrush functionality built in, Google Analytics capability functionality built in, and you can sort of play around with that and then apply machine learning afterwards. That's just about it. Again, I just want to reiterate this. We're doing this for a good cause to raise money for St. Jude's. Please consider donating. It's truly a good cause. Thank you.
Thanks, buddy. That was awesome, man.
Yeah, sweet.
Now, you have my gears turning. Last time I saw this, you got me going. And you got a couple questions in the audience, so I'm going to throw them your way.
Yeah.
Nick Rizzo wants to know, and this is kind of my question too, with zero background in coding or any of these things, is it relatively easy to pick up the basics of utilizing APIs to build my own tools or extract data for data journalism?
Yeah, so I think in the few examples I gave, obviously you have to start learning computer programming a little bit, and honestly you can pick that up in a day or two. Use one of these online services like Code Academy, which is like this interactive tutorial for learning these things. You'll get the basics down in a couple of days.
And that's Python you're talking about, right?
I'm talking about Python, but Code Academy does JavaScript, or it'll teach you HTML and whatever you want to learn. There's a lot of languages available in there, and it's pretty neat. You can check out that presentation I gave that sort of goes into a lot of the basics that'll help. But you saw from like the code examples, there were like 8 lines of code, and you could sort of, even if you understand the concept there and then apply it later, once you start to understand how the code actually works together, I think it's relatively easy to pick up.
Yeah, all I know is like Visual Basic, some HTML, some pseudocode, and just understanding, the concepts, those basic concepts. You can kind of understand
then.
What's that?
You're good to go then. Just pick up a bit of Python and you're rocking.
No, you can look at the code that Paul put up on the screen, and you can kind of work out what it's supposed to do, even if you don't know the actual tags and the actual language itself.
Yeah, and that's why I call it a computer programming language. There is a language to it. If you understand the concept, that's like 90% of the battle. It's just learning the actual vocabulary and how to like construct a sentence, right?
Dude, are you on a blue screen, or is that the color of your
That's
wall?
my wall. That's
oh my god, that's some perfect paint right there.
I should be doing some like green screening.
There you go. So, guys, do we have any other questions for Paul?
I have one. So I came across my first API that had a ridiculously slow rate request limit. Now, we don't make requests very often, but they're made from our web app. So they get made just whenever someone does a certain action. It checks certain things on the API to give them that immediate feedback on whether they should check something or not, if there's any warning signs in the data. They make them so far apart with the seam size we have at the minute that it's going to occasionally, they're not going to get a result. But what's the best way to handle that kind of situation for someone who's a relative API rookie like me that hasn't had to deal with a full second, one request per second or something ridiculous is the limit for this API?
Yeah. I mean, part of working with APIs is understanding that you're utilizing someone else's service, and they're allowed to put whatever sort of restrictions they want on it. And just for people who aren't familiar, rate limiting is essentially, you can only request, to pull an API like every so often at a certain interval. They're putting restrictions on the API usage, even though they're giving you access to it. So you need to look in the documentation what that actual rate limit is. You need to adhere to it. If it's, you can only pull hit the API once every 100 milliseconds. You add in a timer. You wait for 100 milliseconds in between, and then if that affects sort of the user, you need to maybe add in like a loading bar, some indication to let them know that we're working on it. In some instances, you can contact the API provider and see if they'll lift the rate limit for a certain purpose. If you pay them, or if there's an application that they think is mutually beneficial, they may be willing to do that.
Cool, man.
Cool.
And Garrett, this what we were talking about before with figuring out the contextual links, just the internal links that are only linked contextually. I think that this is definitely something you could use to do that. Even with the Ahrefs API with their new internal link feature, you can definitely build something quick like that.
I remember seeing that project that we spoke about on the show a while ago. I don't know if you guys remember the name of the project. It was kind of turned web pages into database formats, so you could query it with SQL.
Was that the tool where you type something in and it was constantly changing? Like, do you remember it was like one of those crazy websites? I
thought that was quite a cool project.
I'm thinking about something
providing a new interface to the web to just
put
cool. The pages in. Yeah, I forget the name now.
Originally, I was like I mentioned earlier. I talked to Stephen Van Bessen like 6 months ago if they were going to put an API into Content King, because I like their crawler and stuff, and it's updated live automatically and all that shit for this purpose. But they haven't got around to it yet. And now that you've mentioned that Ahrefs has a internal link type tool, I'll have to check that out and see what that's all.
Also, I think Content King does have an API.
Oh, is the API fully rolled out?
Yeah, I think you can access. I mean, talk to Steven, obviously, but there's access to some parts of it and not others. The last time I checked, but that was several months ago. It might have even changed since then.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've talked to him about it. So
knowing Garrett's luck, the one bit that isn't in the API is the bit he wants. That's kind of how it's going with that tool so far. I think Garrett's their most weird user or something.
Can you make any use cases for this for like an affiliate SEO? How they would utilize the API for to make a process more simple or more efficient? Or am I putting you on the spot here?
No, I mean it's fine. Like that last example I gave is
Sure.
about acquiring expired domain names. If you were doing that to sort of like a gray hat-ish approach to sort of boost the authority or acquire old content to sort of boost your affiliate. That's one example. You can use an API, to sort of manage your various sources and sort of make sense of that in interesting ways. I think it sort of depends on what are your activities that are sort of driving value for your affiliate programs. Like what are those activities, and then I'm sure there's an application there.
Cool, man. Cool. All right. We have any other questions in the chat for Mr. Paul?
Yeah, come on, fire in some questions. Let's have some. I mean, because
So,
we
Paul,
use
the real big question is, are you excited to be a dad?
Oh man, so excited.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got twins on the way.
Congrats again, man. That's awesome.
Wow, twins. That's a blessing.
No, we have a legit question for you now. Technical SEO has been a resurgent recently, which is awesome. I love tech SEO, obviously, but do you think specializing too heavily on tech SEO could hold someone back career-wise? And that's from Colin McDermott.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. I tweeted out something yesterday that's pretty highly relevant. I was trying to sort of get the community's sense on this, on how organizations are structured. Are you siloing your technical team from your content team, your more creative people? I think it's best. Like we talk about a T-shaped marketer, where you sort of specialize in one area, and you develop your skills in others. Maybe not as skilled in those other areas, but you are specialized in one of them. I think that still holds true. You need to have a semblance of various related skill sets, and then sort of hone in on one. It doesn't make sense to just do technical SEO. That's definitely not going to get you very far. You need to understand all the different aspects. Now, do you need to specialize in other aspects? I think that's probably not the case. You can specialize in one or two or three things and sort of be decent at doing some of the others, or at least understand it.
That's interesting. I always had the kind of impression there were too few good technical SEOs, so I kind of expected the opposite answer, that you'd find it easy to find people desperate for your work if you were one of the few that is able to do it.
I'm saying, like, should you? No. I mean, I agree with you, but that wasn't the question, really, right? It was, is it bad to
would it hold you back, I guess, was the question, in your career? So I was kind of imagining that it would do the opposite of hold you back. So that was all I was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. I think if you focus too much and that really you didn't have an understanding of everything else, that would hold you back. Mm-hmm. If you're going really hard into technical and you like that and you understand everything else surrounding that, you're fine.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Well,
more questions, folks?
I think having your hand in a few buckets opens new opportunities too. Like Paul, we met that guy Dave at Traffic Think Tank. He specializes in schema markup as a service only, and from what I understood, he's like killing it. Like he has too much business. So it's beneficial to try new things, and that you might not be an expert on.
You think that's something that might only last for a short period of time?
I don't think that was his entire business. I think he does other things too. So if it fades out, I'm sure he has other things to fall back on. But
Yeah.
Right.
It's like a stock portfolio. You know, you want to diversify a little bit.
Yeah. And
I
that's
think
what we're
Garrett did a piece about that on the show a little while ago about diversifying. I mean, Vin's taken it too far, becoming a restaurateur, I think. But
Fortunately, I'm not making any food, so that investing in it as far as I go.
We got a quick question from Birdman, who also earlier, I don't know if anyone's read that out, I don't think so, just thanked you heavily for the in-depth knowledge share, Paul. So thank you from them as well. They're just saying, I've heard a lot of talk that AI is being implemented in various aspects of SEO. At the risk of sounding super ignorant, is there any truth to those rumors?
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely. I mean, I guess I need clarity on the question. Is AI or machine learning being applied in the practice of SEO? Like, if that's certainly the case. Like, I do use machine learning in what I'm doing all the time. If the question is Google using machine learning and AI, I think that's also the case. They sort of one of their key engineers has a big AI machine learning background, and he's had a more prominent role in their work at Google search recently. And they said they're using more machine learning.
Yeah, Birdman, I think the answer is yes, it's being used. I think you may be thinking of more about when it's going to be tangible for the everyday SEO, or maybe a beginner intermediate SEO to get their hands on it and use it in a way that'll be helpful in your life. It's definitely being used in technical SEO, like Paul's doing, and Google's certainly using machine learning and AI in their algorithm. But as far as how common it is in the everyday SEO's life, I guess it depends on what you're doing and where you're at. Yeah, I figured. So yeah, it'll become more and more prevalent as there's more use cases and it becomes understood by more and more people. But for now, I think it's guys like Paul who are really into technical SEO that are the ones that are using it most.
Well, from what Paul said during his presentation, I mean, he's working with colleagues on a new toolkit, which I'm assuming is going to make it massively more accessible for people who want to, I'm assuming, buy the toolkit or whatever, however it's going to be released. People who want to access that toolkit, I'm assuming, are going to find it more accessible than it currently is, even for Paul and his colleagues doing it all manually from scratch every time.
Yeah.
So that should probably...
Yeah, and just to clarify on that toolkit, it's a Python toolkit, so it definitely does require some understanding of Python, but it's sort of putting it all in one place and making it a little easier to apply for SEO purposes. But you need to understand how to code.
Yeah. And like Paul suggested, if you guys are interested in getting some coding chops, there's some cool tutorial websites out there. What was the one that you mentioned? Codetree?
Code Academy.
Code Academy.
Yeah.
And I've seen a few other ones out there too. And
I found Learn Python the Hard Way. He had his book up for free at one point. I'm not sure if it's still up for free now, but it would be worth
Python
buying.
2.
They got it for Python 2 is still free. Yeah. Well, Python 3 is really similar. So do Learn Python the Hard Way 2, and then read a blog post about the differences between 2 and 3, and you're good to go.
That's right.
Cool. So you guys have any other questions for Paul? I know we got through a few here.
I mean, I have one just because we had the big conference section on the previous segment. I'd like Paul to tell us a bit more about his conference and why people should go and who goes typically, and just a bit more about it.
Yeah. So it's called Tech SEO Boost, and we just had our second year. We're working on year 3. It's a conference dedicated solely to technical SEO. It's it's a free conference with limited seating. So if you can't get in, we also make it completely available online for streaming, and the videos are available for free afterwards. The audience is sort of a mixture of technical SEOs, people wanting to learn more about technical SEO, web developers that are trying to understand this whole crazy SEO thing. If you're interested in more super advanced SEO, more technical SEO, it's definitely a conference I would have on your radar. It really came out of my own personal desire for a conference like this. So I curate all the speakers, I curate all the topics, and it's things that I think that the SEO community is more interested in when it comes to more advanced topics. So if that's something you like, that's something you enjoy, you're more interested in, definitely check it out.
Yeah, I got to see some of last year's videos, and as a non-technical, non-programmer SEO, it definitely just expanded my horizons just to understand what was being done and the possibilities out there. So even if I have to go and hire a coder to do some of this stuff for me, my head's wrapped around the concept more.
Mm-hmm.
So just to get that much out of it was very beneficial.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of people complaining that the talks at most conferences are too basic, I'm assuming that was part of the motivation for Paul starting it, was there wasn't anything like that really, or there isn't much of it at any conferences. Sounds like the kind of thing, if you want to learn stuff that's not going to be in your typical conference, which has to cater to everyone, it's going to be a good thing to get along to and actually learn some stuff that isn't covered day to day that much.
Oh, yeah. Cool. So are the videos out for this year yet, or
Yeah.
they're on the website?
They're on the website.
It's Catalyst, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could Google Tech SEO Boost.
Tech SEO Boost, and I'll get them up in the chat room. Yeah. Cool. All right, buddy. I appreciate you jumping on short notice, man.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You gonna be at any
conferences
in the near future, Paul?
Have MozCon on the agenda, but outside of that, my conference going days with me being a father to be is somewhat limited this year.
Yeah, we hear that. Well, appreciate it again, man, and we'll talk to you soon, buddy.
All right, have a good one.
Simple. Thanks, man.
Take it easy.
Take care.